Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this third in our series of energy-related opportunities within the sector for the armed forces. My name is Simon Gray and I'm the Chief Executive of the East of England Energy Group, and we're here today to welcome speakers from a number of organisations, including Vattenfall, the Swedish state-owned utility company. We also have Renewable UK, one of our own programmes from EAGA, Skills for Energy. The Ministry of Defence joined as well by Right Management and the Department of Work and Pension. Thanks very much indeed for those of you joining us today. If you'd like to make yourselves comfortable and get yourself a tea or coffee or appropriate beverage of your choice, and we'll be with you in just under 2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. If I can ask those of you joining us today, please to just turn off your camera and turn off your microphone as well, just to help us preserve the bandwidth so that hopefully everyone gets a decent signal to be able to view the seminars today. Well, good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Gray from EAGA, the East of England Energy Group. Welcome to the seminar this morning, looking at renewable energy and decarbonisation. This is the third in our series. We'll be starting in just about a minute's time. If I can just ask you to kindly turn off your camera and your microphone just to help us preserve the bandwidth. Thank you. We'll be starting proceedings in just about 30 seconds' time. We still have quite a few people lined up ready to join us, so we'll just give it another 30 seconds just to let other people join us, and then we'll kick off this morning's session. And if I can just remind everyone, please to turn off their camera and their microphone, just to help us preserve the bandwidth so that everyone hopefully can get to see the full presentation. So I think we'll kick things off now. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Simon Gray. I'm the Chief Executive of EAGA, the East of England Energy Group, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a number of speakers. We have with us today Barnaby Wharton from Renewable UK, the trade association for the wind industry and renewable industry. We also have Matthew Bacon from Vattenfall, who'll be talking about onshore wind, solar and battery. We have Carol Aitken talking about hydrogen, Justin Fowler from National Grid, talking about e-mobility, Jack Welsh from Vattenfall, talking about decarbonisation and district heating, and Sarah Stone from Vattenfall, a case study on her own career and how she came into the sector. If I just remind everyone, please to turn off their cameras and their microphones during the course of the proceedings. That just helps us preserve the bandwidth to make sure that everyone hopefully gets a decent reception online today. What I'd also ask is that during the course of the presentation, if you would be kind enough just to also post any questions you have within the chat function within the seminar today as well. So here's our agenda for this morning, ladies and gentlemen. First off, we have Barnaby Wharton. Barnaby's from Renewable UK, that's the trade association nationally for the renewable industry. We then have Matthew Bacon from Vattenfall. He'll be talking about onshore wind, solar and battery storage. And Vattenfall are the Swedish state provider who now have significant interest in the UK and globally. Carol Aitken from Vattenfall will then be talking about hydrogen. And then Russell Fowler from National Grid will be talking about e-mobility. Later we'll be joined by Jack Welsh, also from Vattenfall, who'll be talking about industrial decarbonisation and district heating. And then we have Sarah Stone from Vattenfall talking about her career and how she came into the industry. Can we have the next slide, please? So now I'll pass over to Barnaby. Barnaby, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. So my name is Barnaby Wharton. I'm from Renewable UK, and I want to introduce the session really just by talking around how the energy system is changing and how we're moving from sort of quite siloed energy structures, I guess, to a much more sort of dynamic and what we call the sort of whole system solutions. So what we've found, and what I want to talk about, is really in the past we've seen electricity generation, road transport and shipping and that sort of thing, heat and industry as very separate energy sectors, with everyone doing kind of their different thing. And I want to explain how that's changing, and we're seeing this sector coupling and things becoming much more dynamic and interactive. If you go on to the next slide, that's about Renewable UK, and Simon has dealt with that, so let's go on to the next slide. So starting with electricity and power, this is how we used to do things. Traditionally, and for many years, electricity was basically generated via coal power stations, gas power stations on the right there, in large centralized stations. So that there was a time, maybe only probably 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when there were only a couple of hundred power stations across the UK, and that generated all our electricity. And that is starting to change, as I'm sure you are aware. We are seeing. Oh, hello.
Is now joining.
So that's starting to change, and that's driven by a couple of things, and we'll come on to that. So we go on to the next slide. So generation is changing, and what we've seen really over the past 10 years is a fundamental change in the way where our power comes from. On the left-hand side there, you've got the blue box at the bottom is coal. So around 20%, 30% of our generation came from coal. And over the past 10 years, that has massively fallen. And what you then also see is wind generation really pick up in the past 10 years as well. So the tiny bars at the top on the left, which are wind and a few other renewable sources, now make up 20% of our power. So we've seen this huge shift from fossil fuel generation to renewable generation. What has driven that? If we go to the next slide. Two things are driving that and will continue to drive that. The first is the need to decarbonise our energy system and our whole economy. We have the Climate Change Act in 2008 committed us to reducing emissions, and the update to that committed us to net zero emissions by 2050. So we've got to get emissions out of the energy system, and the easiest place to start that has been power. And what that's then also driven, that investment and subsidies in renewable generation has supported those industries, and you've seen costs come down. So that's really accelerating this transition from these fossil fuel generation plants to many now millions of small scale and large scale renewable generation of offshore wind, onshore wind and solar in particular. So we're seeing this massive change. And what that also means is, if we skip onto the next slide and just click the button, what we see is this sort of change from this centralized power generation. So in the diamond, you've got the way the system used to be, a centralized power generation, and then you've got through the transmission distribution system, bringing power through the wires to user demand, whether that is households or industry or whatever. We have then introduced renewable generation into the mix, and that has started to decarbonise things, but it's going to continue accelerating. And as I said at the start, we're moving towards this whole system solution. If you just click the slide, that's what that means. And what that means is that because we've got lots more renewable energy on the system, which is cheap and clean, lots of other people are starting to think about how they can take advantage of it and how they can use that in various ways. So we're seeing small scale solar come onto the system. So rather than large generation sites, we've got solar on rooftops, and similar with wind. And with electricity costs coming down and renewable electricity costs coming down, we're looking at how we can store it through battery systems. And I think Matt's going to talk a little bit about that as well. And obviously, cheap electricity is green electricity, and with battery costs coming down, we're starting to see electric vehicles decarbonise. So rather than everyone going to their system, they go to the petrol station, they're going to their petrol pump. So we're seeing the system change, and all these sectors come together. Just to jump onto the next slide. And we see households changing as well. So the house of the future on the left, lots of electrification in there, heat
is
and
now
things.
Exiting.
So your renewable heat, battery storage, thermal storage at home. So again, these sectors are coming together. So everything's being electrified. We're also introducing green hydrogen, powered by new renewable electricity to turn water into hydrogen and oxygen. That'll decarbonize heat as well. So again, renewable electricity, turning, creating green gas, power for vehicles. So we're seeing all of these different sectors come together, and it's a hugely exciting period of change. Final slide. And what you're seeing is all these companies seeing this sector coupling and getting into these different businesses. So on the right there, you've got Shell buying LimeJump, which is an energy flexibility company, and Sonnen, which is a battery storage company. The Vattenfall, who are with us today, are doing lots in the electric vehicle space. RES, who are traditionally a wind generator, again, in batteries. So we're seeing all these different sectors in the energy system come together as renewable generation comes forward, as costs fall, and everything starts linking up as we try to decarbonise our system. Really rapid run through. I think I've gone a couple minutes over, apologies. But over to Matt to say what that means for, I think, solar and wind.
Thanks very much, Barney. Hi. Next slide, please. Morning, everyone. My name's Matt Bacon. I thought I would give you a little bit of my kind of career experience, as I know that many of you will be thinking about your next steps after working in the forces. I graduated with a history degree in 2008. I worked in digital marketing for a number of different companies, sort of floating around, not really sure what to do with myself after graduating. After a little while, I joined the civil service on the graduate training programme. I worked for 5 years in Whitehall for DEC, which was the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and also DEFRA, which was the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Some of my time in DEC, I was working on energy security issues, so starting to cross over a little bit into some of the things that you might be thinking about in your current day jobs around geopolitics and other things like that. So I have a little bit of insight into some of the sort of broader defence issues and things that you guys have to worry about. I joined Vattenfall in 2016. I worked in our Public and Regulatory Affairs team, which basically means representing Vattenfall's views to senior politicians and civil servants in the UK. I then moved into onshore wind market development in October 2019. And what that really means is I'm responsible for balancing environmental, technical and economic issues in wind farm design, and getting us from basically a patch of land, probably a hillside somewhere in the country, to a final investment decision for constructing a wind farm there. So it's a huge range of spinning lots of different plates, basically, and keeping the show on the road, with a hell of a lot of support from technical specialists within Vattenfall. And really, what I've learned from all this is that the skills that you pick up in your career are highly transferable between different employers, different roles within the same employer, and also between the public and private sector as well. But enough about me. I'll talk a little bit about onshore renewables in the next slide, please. Thank you. So a couple of points on what are the advantages of wind and solar and battery in terms of thinking about your career and next steps. I mean, firstly, it's carbon free. So if that excites you, if you're worried about climate change, it's a great reason to get up in the morning to go to work. It's also the cheapest way to generate electricity now. Barney's talked a little bit about why that is. But wind and solar are the cheapest ways, bar nothing else, to generate power. So that's obviously going to be one of the first places that investment is going. Jobs are based all over the country, really. This isn't a London and the southeast of England type role. I work in Hexham in Northumberland. We have offices in Penzance, in South Wales, in Aberdeen, in Edinburgh, and lots of companies like that. In fact, are very similar. There's jobs all over the country for you. It's a reversible form of infrastructure development. There isn't a lot of kind of development that with impact on the landscape that you can sort of take away and basically put back again exactly as it was, 30 years in 30 years time. So sort of the footprint of the work that you do doesn't have a long tail. There's benefits for local communities. Lots of money is invested by wind companies in particular in local communities, in social schemes, in job opportunities, all that sort of thing as well. We often our habitat management plans on onshore renewables. If you're interested in biodiversity and the environment, there's a lot of good work that we do to preserve and enhance the land that we work on. And most importantly of all, I think it's a rewarding and a challenging career to be in. Just in terms of, I've got a few pictures here just to kind of give you a bit of a bit of an overview of the different technologies. They're not actually very complicated. You've got your wind turbines on sort of towers, basically. There are access tracks you can see in the picture there connecting them. There's an electricity substation. There's a welfare facility, an operations centre. And that is pretty much it in a nutshell. For solar, it's pretty similar really. There are solar panels, access tracks between them. You probably won't even have an operations centre, maybe for a solar farm. The one that's maybe a bit newer and a bit harder for people to picture is the one on the bottom right there, which is a battery storage facility. That's co-located at our Pennick Cymoedd wind farm in South Wales. Really what that is they're shipping containers filled with lithium-ion batteries. In this case, they are actually second life BMW i3 electric vehicle batteries. And the purpose of battery storage today at the moment is to kind of keep the grid frequency. The frequency of the national electricity grid needs to be balanced on a shorter than a microsecond or shorter than a second by second basis to keep everything ticking over. And that's what battery storage is emerging to do, is to help balance that system. If you could skip on one, please. Thank you. This is a little bit of a recap really on what Barney's already covered, which is just to show the kind of fantastic growth in the sector over the last 10 years. Wind and solar, in 2009 was a fairly niche part of the energy system, and it's grown hugely in the last 10 years. The solar there actually tends to be seen in the energy system as a reduction in demand because a lot of it's on people's houses. So that 1% is not a kind of fair reflection of the contribution of solar to the energy system, but kind of a technical point. But really, the point of this is to say that we've seen, we're now a mainstay of the UK electricity system. It's not a niche kind of hippie technology anymore. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the point of this slide really is to say, well, you haven't missed the boat in terms of transferring a career into renewables. We've seen significant growth, and that's the green line for solar and the grey line for onshore wind. We've seen significant growth in installed capacity, but we basically need to do again what we've done over the last 10 years. We need to do that again over the 2020s. Next slide, please. I think I'm running out of time. I think you've seen some of this before, but there's a lot to developing a wind farm. This is very similar. Onshore wind is very similar, and solar to offshore. You have a development cycle, which is the bit I work in. Typically takes maybe 5 years for a project, 2 years to build it, 30 years to run it, and a year or so to decommission it and take it down. And there are a variety of jobs. This is just a bit of a cross section, really. In the two lists below, throughout the operational life of onshore wind, solar or battery. So there are things in project management, in communications, technical jobs in wind resource and in environmental issues, legal matters, construction management, aviation specialists, technicians, commercial managers, civil engineers, electrical engineers. So there's a huge amount of variety to develop and operate a wind farm. Next slide, please. Thanks. And I've done two sort of jobs in Vattenfall really, and I just wanted to kind of reflect on these, which is that, you know, I think in a sort of public and regulatory affairs role in communications, what's really important is that, you know, you're comfortable presenting to people. You've got to be persuasive to politicians. You've got to be able to see the bigger picture. So how does, you know, government aspirations and energy policy impact on your company that you're working for? There's a huge amount of information flying around, so they're sifting through the chatter and the noise to understand what the company needs is critical. And then, you know, energy policy, energy systems are highly complicated, so being able to break those issues down into simple messages is really important. For onshore wind project management, you've just got to be organized. Basically, you've got to keep track of budgets and timelines, and there's lots of spinning plates. There's a lot of focus on commercial skills. So if you're negotiating rents with landowners or terms, contract terms with suppliers, good commercial grounding is really important. Understanding the gist of technical issues, but not getting sucked down into the detail of them. Keeping things happening is probably the most important thing, really, is just keeping momentum. And lastly, resilience against setbacks in your project. Key message for this is I think these are all fairly generic skills, really, that you'll get in almost any job. So I think just being able to take those skills that you've got already and transfer them into a new environment is all that you need to do. Thank you. I'll stop talking now and hand over to my colleague, Carol.
Thank you, Matt. So my name is Carol Aiken, and I am the Public and Regulatory Affairs Advisor at Vattenfall. And those of you who are paying attention will notice that that's the role that Matt has recently vacated. We did have a short period of handover between the two of us where we worked together. But I think it demonstrates very nicely the point that Matt was making about the transferability of skills within the energy sector, that Matt has done the role that I'm doing now. And I actually came to Vattenfall about 18 months ago, maybe a little more, from Centrica. And many of you will, if you don't know the name Centrica, will recognise Centrica as the owner of British Gas. So very much an engineering-based, fossil fuel-based organisation in those days, though it is going through its own transition. And I think what I feel really comfortable about working in Vattenfall about is the fact that it seems to be the future, that the renewable sector is looking forward, whereas working in the oil and gas sector before felt a little bit like looking back. And the coolest thing of all about having made the transition myself into the renewable sector, not least of all that it recognises that the skills I had were still relevant, is that my teenage children think what I do is really cool, and are quite really proud of the fact that we're here trying to change the planet. So as Matt says, if saving the planet is something that makes you want to get up in the morning, then working in the renewable sector is definitely for you. Can I have the next slide, please? Actually, the next again. So I look after a number of policy areas in our technologies within Vattenfall, and one of them is hydrogen and the other one is heat. My colleague Jack Welsh is going to talk to you about decarbonisation of heat, and I'm going to talk to you about hydrogen. I would first say that one of my amongst my transferable skills, engineering and science does not feature at all, so I am not a scientist. So I asked one of my colleagues who is a little bit more scientific about what is hydrogen. And this is the definition that I have, that it's the absolute smallest of all elements, so small that 4 billion laid end to end could fit in the head of one pin. At room temperature, hydrogen is a clear gas. All very interesting. But for me, the really, really interesting thing about hydrogen is how versatile it is, and the fact that it is essentially low carbon. Amongst the other information that my colleague provided was the fact that a number of industrial processes, heat and transport included, use fossil fuels such as methane or diesel. And obviously, when these are used in power stations or on your cooker or in your car, it combines oxygen to provide energy. But byproducts, as we all know, are carbon dioxide and water. If we replace fossil fuels with hydrogen and develop new technologies for industrial processes, for heat and for transport, then we get the energy that we need, but the only byproduct of that is water. However, and this is a bit I did know as well, that in order to make hydrogen, Vattenfall will need to use renewable energy to split the water into its parts via a process we call electrolyzer. And then we transport it to where it's needed, and then it provides carbon-free energy. So it's very much the future of the future. And you'll hear a lot of people talking about it in very excited terms. I think what it lacks at the moment is a clarity about how it's going to be used. Can I have the next slide? Can I have the next one again? Sorry. And part of the answer to how it will be used and therefore where the jobs around hydrogen will be created, bearing in mind this is very much future gazing, is around the sectors which are slow or difficult to decarbonize. And we know, for example, that heavy industry is very resistant to the decarbonisation process just because of the amount of energy it needs and the temperatures it needs it at. Emissions from industry currently account for about a quarter of all UK emissions, and will need to be cut to zero if we're to meet our climate change ambitions. Transport, all forms of transport, heavy transports, trains, airplanes, the cars that you drive on the roads, account for 33% of carbon emissions. This is another sector where clearly something needs to happen, and hydrogen begins to present something of a solution. Can I have the next slide? So hydrogen is versatile in terms of supply and use. It's a free energy carrier that can be produced by many energy sources, and it can enable renewables to provide an even greater contribution to the decarbonisation process that we're all very much engaged on at the moment. It has the potential to help with variable outputs from renewables, and such as solar and photovoltaics. Can I have the next slide, please? So looking to the future, the fact is the future is happening now, enigmatic terms. So where can hydrogen play a role, and where will we be looking to hopefully invest and diversify into hydrogen going forward? Well, as an energy carrier to decarbonise processes that are difficult to electrify through our direct use of electricity, for example, it can be put into transport fuel cells for heavy, long-distance modes of transport, which can't be cost-effectively electrified. And I'm particularly thinking about buses and shipping. Where hydrogen is a feedstock for the energy-intensive industries like steel and the chemical sector. Vattenfall in the Nordics is very much engaged with a project called Hybrit, which is just demonstrating how you can replace the fossil fuels of the past with hydrogen to create the right processes for the production of steel. And the one I suppose that is talked about a great deal in the UK is that hydrogen is a provider of flexible fossil-free electricity and heat from combined heat and power plants to support systems with high volatility. This means that hydrogen has a large storage potential and is suitable to serve as a flexible fuel in a power system. And it means that as the need for renewables increases and there's a need for more flexibility in the system, hydrogen can step in to meet that gap. Can I have the next slide, please? Vattenfall has very little on the ground in terms of hydrogen in the UK at the moment, although we are very, very involved in it elsewhere in Northern Europe. I've already mentioned some of the stuff that we're doing in Sweden, but in the Netherlands also, we are engaged in a project to look at hydrogen storage. So we see hydrogen as being an essential fuel for the future, but we also believe that the UK could be a world leader in hydrogen production. However, can we have the last slide, please? We need a few things to happen for that to happen. The first thing I would mention is, and Matt's already talked about the value of onshore wind, but I would also point out that Vattenfall is very much engaged in offshore wind production, And we need an upscaling the offshore wind industry to bring forward hydrogen at scale. The reason for that is, as I've already explained, we need renewable electricity to put through an electrolyser, so produce the hydrogen at scale that we need. We need a government hydrogen strategy. Everybody is running around talking about hydrogen in very excited terms, but there are no clear visions coming forward from government, at least the industry is well ahead of it, from government, about where hydrogen can be best used, what this means for jobs, what this means for the future of the economy. So we need a much clearer idea on all of that. And probably what we need is a sector-by-sector approach. I've already talked a little bit about how it's heavy industry and it's transport, where hydrogen has most application in the first instance. It's not confined to that, but that's certainly where we would see it being used. So we need the government to sit down with industry and say, okay, right, we want to decarbonise transport, and this is the role of hydrogen within transport decarbonisation. Or we want to decarbonise industry, and these are the targets for hydrogen. So that means that what we need are clear targets by sector so that we can maximise the energy use through hydrogen. In terms of Vattenfall's own ambitions for hydrogen in the UK, we are looking in the first instance at how it can be used in transport in the northeast of Scotland and in the southeast of England. But it is, as I keep repeating, very much a view of the future. And I think we need to persuade the government to come forward with this energy strategy so it can start to reach its potential, both in terms of job creation and its contribution towards decarbonisation. And I will now hand over to Russell Fowler of National Grid, who I'm sure it will explain how all these energy systems are going to come together.
Thank you. Yes, everybody. My name is Russell Fowler. I work for National Grid, and I look at decarbonisation of transport. So probably worth giving a brief introduction to National Grid. So if we can move on to the next slide. Always good to know who we are. So broadly speaking, we own and manage the gas pipes and electricity wires across the UK. Now, as this is about e-mobility, I'm really going to focus on the electricity side, but say we do own the large gas pipes across the country. The way to think about the wires that we own are they're like the motorways or the big A roads in England and Wales. There's a separate owner in Scotland. And then underneath us is what we refer to as distribution network operators, and these own the local roads of the wires, so they'll take the electricity to your door. Part of National Grid is also a legally separate business called the Electricity System Operator. Now, these manage the electricity system. Now, earlier, Barnaby kind of mentioned that you need to balance the system on a second-by-second or microsecond-by-microsecond basis. So this is the part of the business that looks at that. These are the people that you often will see on television. They have the large kind of war room type control room with them for the country. On them, they're frequently on television telling you about how we haven't had any coal generation for 2 months. They've got the longest run since the Industrial Revolution recently, and how we have some of the cleanest electricity that we've had now. It's probably a quick note to say National Grid isn't. National Grid doesn't supply electricity, so you can't buy your electricity from us, nor do we own any power stations. In fact, we're not legally allowed to own power stations. We can only move the energy around. Now, you see some statistics on there. I won't read them out, but probably one to note is that the kind of reliability of the network there. The transmission system is a very reliable way to move energy around the system. So if we can move on to the next slide, it's worth thinking about what is e-mobility. Now, you often kind of hear this phrase mentioned about saying, oh, we need more e-mobility, or we need more development or funding here. So what is this? Very simply, it is just the use of electricity in a vehicle, and this could be from left-hand side there to what we call micro mobility. So this is literally e-bikes and scooters, e-scooters and bits and pieces like that, right up to very large scale aeroplanes and ships, which in theory you could look to electrify or part electrify. So in this context, why is e-mobility important? Well, as a country, as we've talked about, we've committed to eliminating our carbon emissions by 2050. This is the net zero goal that you often hear spoken about. Now, as Carol mentioned earlier, of all the sectors that are out there, the transport sector is the dirtiest sector out there. In fact, has been since about 2017, where it overtook the electricity industry. And that's partly because of the coal closures and the increase in renewables that we've seen on the system has been cleaning up the electricity sector. So the transport sector is now the largest emitter. That's why you want to focus on transport and reducing those carbon emissions. And if you switch from fossil fuels, how most transporters run at the moment, to clean electricity, so renewable electricity, then you will reduce the carbon emissions from transport. So that's the ultimate goal here. Now, if you break the transport sector down even smaller there, you can see the subsectors on the slide. Cars or kind of small vans, kind of light vans, are the largest emitters within the sector. And we've seen kind of recent growth in electric vehicles out there. If you're out on the road, you don't have to wait that long before you've seen an electric vehicle go past. They're around 300,000, what we refer to as plug-in electric vehicles in there. So there are other vehicles that will say they're electric, they will have a battery in there, but they're not charged by plugging in. As effectively they're charged off their petrol engine. We don't really classify them as e-mobility because they still effectively run on fossil fuels. But within electric vehicles, there's a huge range from there, some kind of very small vehicles like a Renault Twizy right up to kind of like a top of the range Tesla Model X and all shapes in between there. And talking about e-mobility more broadly, you're likely to see an increase in e-mobility as you move up in size or weight of the vehicle and distance travelled. So the heavier a vehicle and the longer a vehicle has to go, the more difficult it is to convert to electricity. So you can see vehicles and bikes kind of works really well, and you will see electric buses out there. Electric HGVs are starting to be thought about and developed. And then lastly, you like to see aviation and maritime, which can be really challenging to electrify aircraft. That's why, as Carol mentioned there, you're going to need other solutions such as hydrogen to look to reduce the carbon emissions in those sectors. But if we focus on e-mobility, if we move on to the next slide, so what is there to support e-mobility? So sure, at the moment, you can go and buy an electric car, an electric bike at the moment. So what is there to help you? Well, as I mentioned, everything is kind of underpinned by the 2050 target. So this is to reduce our carbon emissions to zero or net zero by 2050. And underneath that, there's kind of various policies that look to support that. As you can imagine, as these come from various government departments, there are a large number of them. So I'll talk around a few here that are relatively important. So you have the National Infrastructure Commission, and they do an assessment periodically to look at what infrastructure we need to do, and that will look across everything. But particularly it will focus on energy and what needs to happen in the energy sector to help us meet our net zero goals. There's also various clean air strategies, and you can see this in various cities where you have clean air zones. So looking to ban kind of older petrol and diesel cars there, or certainly put a levy on them as well, so only allowing cleaner vehicles into city centres or areas where there are high levels of air pollution. Now, the next one, OLEV. OLEV is an amusing acronym, I find. So it's the Office of Low Emissions Vehicles. So it's a government department that looks specifically at, as it says, low emissions vehicles. So electric vehicles will live in there. And they have a strategy of how they can get to zero emissions for road transport. The Department of Transport itself has its own setting the challenge, as it calls it. So how can it get all of transport to zero emissions by 2050? There's even recently been announced a Jet Zero Council, and this is going to look at how aviation can be decarbonised. So there really is strategies and initiatives across various sectors of government. So it's a very kind of rich sector if you're interested in reading up about what policies and regulations are in place. A few things I haven't put on there. There's various bus strategies. And more recently, there's been movements on micro-mobility. So you may have seen making kind of e-scooters legal and testing them in various areas. So the whole range of transport, there is lots of opportunities here. I will focus on the one at the bottom, which is called Project Rapid, and a recent £500 million fund that was announced for that in the last budget. So in March. So Project Rapid here refers to rapid charging of electric vehicles. So if we move on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit around electric vehicle charging. Now, there's broadly 5 ways you can charge your car. One of the big benefits is you can charge your car at home. You can charge it locally. So this may be like a piece of charging infrastructure in the street. So if you maybe don't have a driveway or a garage, you can charge your vehicle on the street. The destination, so this is where you're going, so it's maybe a work or a supermarket or some other location. I'll skip over en route because I want to talk a little bit more about that. Or you can have some kind of fleet charger. So if you have a fleet car, vehicle, you can probably charge that maybe at some local area or local depot. Now, en route charging is quite important because a survey relatively recently by the AA said that of people that don't own electric vehicles, almost 80% are concerned by the lack of rapid charges. So when they go out and they drive a long distance, they want to be able to charge their vehicle relatively quickly. And this means something replicating the petrol station type model, where you need a kind of nationwide network and it needs to be quick. You're talking around 10-15 minutes to pretty much charge your electric vehicle up. And this issue was kind of noted by the government that there's a little bit of a gap here. So what they said recently in the Project Rapid was saying, okay, we note that there is an issue here, so we're going to look to mandate a number of rapid chargers across the country, and kind of by the 2030s they're looking for around 6,000 chargers at around 100 locations. So these are going to be on key parts of the motorway network and kind of strategic A roads, so your large A roads there, where you can go in, charge your electric vehicle in 10 or 15 minutes. So that's particularly interesting because in terms of developing that, we think in National Grid that's going to need an awful lot of people to help develop that. By the time you put that and larger types of vehicle, we mentioned HGVs and buses, we think that broadly in the decarbonisation sector to 2050, you're going to need around 400,000 jobs. Now, some of these will be new jobs and some of these will be replacing jobs that people are looking to retire, but they're pretty significant uptake required there. And it's going to be a very broad set of skills that will be required. So if you're talking about installing electricity infrastructure, you're going to need civil engineering to do the work. You're going to need mechanical engineering to build some of the infrastructure, and obviously electrical engineering to get into there. But also you're going to need behind that, you're going to need people that data analytics and machine learning and very skilled tradespeople to be able to deliver these. So there's a huge broad range of skills that are going to be needed to develop this nationwide charging infrastructure, and it will be nationwide. So again, these opportunities will be broadly spread across the countries, and particularly kind of focused in the north of England, Scotland, Wales, and the Midlands, where a lot of the transport infrastructure goes across. Myself, as National Grid, we're based in the Midlands. We're based in Warwick here, so a lot of roles coming out of these parts of the country. As I say, it really is an interesting sector to be involved in. It is a growth sector. I know some of the questions coming in have been looking at that, saying where are the growth sectors? We definitely think that electric vehicles and more broadly decarbonisation transport is a growth sector there. So it really is an industry to keep an eye out and a watch on to see what happens there. So that's the end of my time. Been really great to talk to people here there, and I'm really happy to take questions later on in the session. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over now to Jack Welsh, who's going to be talking about industrial decarbonisation and district heat.
Thanks very much, Russell. Next slide, please. Good morning, everyone. My name's Jack Welsh. I'm based in Edinburgh. I work for Vattenfall, where in Edinburgh we've been recently appointed as a joint venture partner with Midlothian Council to develop a citywide network, district heating network in and around Edinburgh. But there are projects developing all over the UK. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Heat networks are very common throughout the continent. In the UK, they are less so, simply because we've had fantastic access to the natural gas resources of the North Sea and a natural gas grid developed over many, many years. But essentially what heat networks do is effectively they can provide a strong source of decarbonised heat. The heat is in the form of hot water, which is transported to customers in a series of pipes. So essentially what we're doing is effectively in a position where we can move heat around a city. We can take heat from various sources. We can take heat from waste heat. We can take heat from data centers, and we can use heat to generate, heat pumps to generate heat from the ground and from the air. The key thing is that we're in a phase just now of decarbonising heat. We are looking to digitize heat, for example, using data to understand where heat needs to flow to and from, and to measure heat, for example, in your home. And we're also in the process of electrifying heat. And we talked about sector coupling earlier. So that's using, for example, the opportunities to take heat from low carbon sources like offshore wind, which are in a rapid source of or phase of development, and utilizing sometimes where the wind is blowing and ultimately there are not enough consumers of electricity to essentially electrify heat. So let's take that spare electricity and inject it into heat networks. In this slide, you can see effectively our source of waste heat on the left of the slide, and going through effectively a heat substation, which acts as a breakdown station for local distribution of heat, and then on the far right, a local network with customers. So that's homes, commercial businesses, and developments. Next slide, please. So why is carbon, effectively, why is carbon important? So what we're saying is essentially we're in a fast transition now to move to zero carbon. Natural gas, although a clean air source of energy, is obviously a carbon emitting source of energy, and we are transitioning away from that. It's very much about also improving local air quality, which I think we've seen in the recent lockdown. Significant improvements in citywide centres through removal of vehicles. There'll be a further step change improvement, for example, if gas burning is removed from city centres. But we're also looking at meeting new planning legislation, which is very much driving this change to low carbon fuels as well within homes and businesses. And as I said before, heat networks can take multiple sources of low carbon heat. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier heat substation. So effectively think of that as a large single garage, which acts as a breakdown station between the main pipework network and local network. Typically, these would serve around 200 homes. It's a mechanism to manage the network to look after things like the water quality in that network, to measure and monitor any leakage, and to potentially manage that local network at a lower temperature. And at a lower temperature, you suffer less heat losses from the network, but also importantly, it means that you've got more flexibility in terms of managing heat from waste sources. Next slide, please. Within your own home, if you're connected to a heat network, essentially you would have installed a heat interface unit. Think of that as effectively like a small a replacement for your gas boiler. It essentially contains the equipment that allows you to take heat from the network and use it within your property for heating and hot water, and isolates your house effectively from the network. It is essentially a heat exchanger. Next slide, please. I talked earlier about digitisation. In the future, and the future is actually pretty well now, essentially what we're doing is measuring as much as we can, gathering as much data about the networks we operate. This will make it simpler and much more efficient to operate those networks, because essentially we'll be able to change flow rates, we'll be able to change the heat outputs right down to a customer level, because we'll have full visibility of what each customer is needing and is using on our network. Now, this digitization allows us a fantastic view of our customers. And those are customers sometimes that not only are we selling heat to, but we might also be selling cooling to, because essentially one customer's cooling, when we extract heat from a customer's premises, becomes another customer's heating. And this is where heat networks will really start to play a big role, especially in urban citywide schemes. Looking to the future, I think heat will become very much heat as a service. So you won't necessarily pay heat measured in kilowatt hours, but you'll pay for a level of comfort within your property. Next slide, please. I thought it was important to put this slide together because it shows you essentially a timeline and a life cycle of a typical project, and it shows really the scope and breadth of jobs and roles that actually are part of our industry. Everything from my role as a business development manager, at the very start of a project, identifying a potential customer, potential use for our heat network, right through to the end where we've essentially bespoke a system, designed a system, and essentially put a system into the ground and operating it to an asset manager, operations and customer services facing roles. And on the very bottom, you see the design stage, which I expect, some of you will be familiar with. And obviously, we engage with a significant supply chain partnership, everything from, for example, design engineering right through to construction and management. Next slide, please. I'd just like to flag here is that this is a really exciting area. We're building large at-scale projects. This is a slide showing the network in Amsterdam. There's lots of crossover with traditional industries and employment sectors, for everything from project management, utilities, and indeed in my own role, Carol mentioned this earlier, I worked in the oil and gas industry for 20 years. And I'm now working in renewable energy. You know, these are all transferable skills, and I'm very much turned from a sort of poacher into a gamekeeper type role. Next slide, please. A very last quick element to the industrial decarbonisation, which I was asked to talk about. This is a complex area, and really what I'm flagging here is there's lots of work being done in this area, particularly in the steel industry, where we can actually now make steel using low carbon sources of energy. I'd like to end there and hope you found that interesting. I'm happy to take questions at the end, and I'd like to now hand over to Sarah Stone. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Jack. Hi, everybody. My name is, can you move on to the next slide, please? My name is Sarah Stone. I am a consultant working for Vattenfall. I work in the onshore team on our South Kyle project, which is a new project that we're about to start construction. And once it's built, it will be the UK's second largest onshore wind farm. And I've been asked to come and talk to you today because I spent a bit of time in the army a long time ago, and I'm also married to somebody who's in the army, so I'm a military spouse. In my kind of spare time, I do quite a lot of work supporting military spouses and partners as serving personnel. And one thing I would say actually is that we're your secret weapon. If you're still serving, there's a lot of expertise within the non-serving community. So if you're looking to network with people, it's a great place to start. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I say, I'm a freelance consultant. One thing I would say is there's obviously a huge range of jobs, but a lot of them are with our suppliers. So and that is a really good place to start. I think there was a webinar last week that Rob Lilly was spoke in, and he put a slide up where he listed the names of the companies that we work with. And I think that's a really good place to look for some of these jobs, because the vast majority of jobs are with our suppliers as opposed to with us, although we obviously do have some. But I'm a supplier, so I'm an example of that. So in my current role, I am focusing on maximising the socioeconomic benefits of the development. So that's working with economic development agencies and anchor institutions locally and in the region to identify different ways that we can add value to the community and the place that plays host to our developments. A lot of what I do is about connecting people, and it is about, I do a lot of work looking at how can we get local people employed with our suppliers, how can we get local businesses into our supply chain. And that has actually been really interesting because it's given me a really good overview of the kinds of jobs that our suppliers want and the kind of skill set that they need. And one thing that is very true is that they do really value people with military skills. So they just, especially in the construction industry, they're crying out for people with military expertise. Can you move to the next slide, please? So I was asked to tell you about my career path, which is a bit random. Don't know if this is going to be of any help to you. And I asked my husband, because I said, obviously I left the army. I was in the army for about 5 minutes a really long time ago. And I asked him how I was going to be able to give you some advice, and he said, well, you've had a really potted career history, and that is true. And I think the one thing that I would say is that when I left the army, I was still really young, and I left to go to university. And although I was happy with the decision to leave, it took me about 10 years. I was kind of lost to find my way again. And I think that's normal as well. And I only I went into the events industry because I thought that I wanted a job that wasn't behind a desk, and I was good at organising things. And that was true. And I was quite good in the events industry, but I wasn't as happy as I'd been in the military. And I realised it was because the military for me was more than a job. It was a purpose, and it was giving me something that had meaning and something that made a difference. And so I realised that that's what I needed to do with my career. And so around 2006, I changed and moved into politics. And I don't know if this is any use to you, but having decided that I wanted to do something that made a difference, I then went to look at different organisations that I could work for. And so I looked at places like the National Trust, World Wildlife Fund, the BBC, the government, all these kinds of jobs, and happened to find one for the Conservative Party rather randomly. And it was in comms. So I was able to sidestep, and I suppose that's all, and get a foot in the door. And then I dropped a level, but then I worked my way back up again. And obviously, I had a fantastic career in politics, and then the military moved us, and that's why I moved to Scotland. And I've kind of refocused since I was in Scotland on social value. So yes, so I don't know if that's any help to you, but that was all I would kind of give you as a takeaway, is perhaps have a think about the kinds of things you want to do, and then maybe don't necessarily expect to go straight in the perfect job. You could start a bit lower and work your way up, because the skill set that you've actually, can you move on to the next slide, please? This is it. The skills that you've got in the military mean that you can pretty much do anything. You can turn your hand to anything, and it's your attitude that employers want, and you can't learn that. So you can you can gain experience and you can learn skills, but you can't really learn attitude and mindset. And so if you can, as long as you're in the right place, you can work your way up. And I think that is, the other thing I was going to say is that the renewable industry is not that dissimilar to the military, in the sense that there are, I think that's kind of come across in all the presentations, but there are a lot of jobs. So you know how you can kind of do pretty much any job in civilian world in the military. It's kind of true about the renewable industry. There's a huge range, and so it's about working out, I think, what you want to focus, and then find the companies that are doing that, and then network and work out how you can kind of get in. That is it. So yeah, work out what you want to do and where you want to be realistic about your expectations. Don't expect to just walk into your dream job. Just basically try and get a foot in the door, and then and network, and use your networks to do that. LinkedIn is a really good place to network, and I think that's the other thing that perhaps as a military spouse we can kind of tell you about, is that we transition a lot. So every time we move, we have to transition, and we have to change jobs, and it is we learn a huge amount about how important a network is to do that. So LinkedIn's very good. Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of our speakers. So my name's Gemma Head. I'm Skills for Energy Programme Manager at EAGA, and I'm just going to pose a couple of questions. We've got a couple of minutes just before the close of the session, so I'm going to pick up on a couple of the questions that are asked within the chat box. If we don't get to your questions today, then we will answer them after the webinars and make sure that everybody's got the answers that they're looking for. So the first question it was pitched to Barnaby. Barnaby, in your opinion, where is the biggest immediate growth area?
That's a surprisingly huge question. And I mean, there's so much change going on in the sector right now. So I mean, the onshore and offshore wind sectors are going to continue to grow. We've got about 10 gigawatts of offshore wind right now. We're going to have 40 by 2030, hopefully. So that's growing hugely. Solar is going to be really important, and we need more solar. But I think that the really interesting areas are in sort of what we call the sort of ancillary services around the energy system. So not just the big bits of kit that we're building, but the role of batteries and getting batteries onto the system, how we roll out the electric vehicle charging networks, and stuff that we covered around. I mean, hydrogen tiny now, going to be massive soon, but it's got to go through that initial stage. So everything really, I guess, is the answer. It's just such a massive, a massive area of change. So I guess my advice would be kind of, what do you want to do in terms of the sort of job, rather than the actual sector you want to be in? Because, as has been said, every bit of this industry needs everyone to be pitching in, because it's such a huge piece of change. I'm not sure if that was a very helpful answer.
I'm sure they would have found it helpful. Thank you, Barnaby. Just moving on to the next question. So we had the question, where will the largest number of jobs emerge within heat networks, including the supply chain? That was pitched to Jack, but if anybody wants to pitch in, they're more than welcome.
If I can pick up, first of all, I think the point that was made earlier around specifically Vattenfall, we engage and work with a huge number of supply chain partners. So, for example, in district heating, you would be looking at organisations that, for example, currently work with other companies in the infrastructure area. For example, in putting sort of water pipes in the ground and connecting customers through plumbing, through organisations that use, for example, project managers. So again, the supply chain is going to receive a huge boost, for example, with heat networks. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks, Jack. And I think we've just got time for one more question. So we'll just take a look. So the last question came from William Rhodes. How are they going to deal with rural heating solutions? Is it just for high density living? Distance from heat source must be a major limiting factor, plus the cost of installation / retrofit to existing housing.
I can pick that up again, but I notice Carol has got her hand up. So Carol, do you want to say something on this one?
My hand up was for the last question, actually.
Okay.
And I was going to talk about the need for energy efficiency measures, installations in homes, which we've seen an significant announcement on today, because those are jobs which are happening now, are really in the pipeline. In terms of rural heating solutions, I think it's horses for courses. Absolutely, district heating needs a density of population. But there are a number of technical solutions out there which vary between large-scale heat pumps and individual home heat pumps. And again, we've seen an announcement from government about the future of the renewable heat incentive, which begins to deal, if it's used properly, with the need to have a bespoke solution for rural areas. But hand over to Jack, who knows more about this than I do.
Thanks, Carol. I would just emphasise what Carol was saying there. The key thing with energy use, particularly heating, is minimising the heat demand for your business or your property. And indeed, when you do that, that's where new technology like heat pumps work best. So in a rural environment, most people will have a connection to their electricity network. And a heat pump operating using electricity is a great way to effectively provide home heating. But yeah, and as Carol pointed out again, heat networks work best where the heat density is high, heat and cooling density is high. So that's where in an urban environment where you've got multiple sources of heat being produced, that's waste heat that would be normally just rejected to the atmosphere, or for example, where you've got high demands for cooling in offices, this is where a heat network can work really, really well and make a huge positive impact for both customers and the local environment, and importantly for significantly reducing carbon. That's me, Gemma.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack, and thank you to everybody for answering the question. Given time, I will hand back to Simon to close the session, but thank you again, and we will get the answers to the other questions out as soon as we can. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, everyone. Fascinating insight into the industry there. So clearly it's not just jobs working on wind farms themselves, but it's the whole infrastructure that goes along with that, and also what we're doing in the future of our homes on how we're going to better insulate and better power our homes as well domestically and on the industrial side as well. So thank you very much indeed for all our speakers today. Barnaby from Renewable UK, Matthew from Vattenfall, Carol from Vattenfall, and Russell Fowler from National Grid, Jack from Vattenfall, and Sarah Stone from Vattenfall, and of course our own Gemma Head. Thank you all very much indeed. I hope you'll be able to join us again for the next seminar we have on the renewable sector. And thank you very much. And if I could ask our speakers to remain online, but everyone else, see you soon, I hope. Take care. Bye-bye. Stay safe.